All right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So as Hoshin mentioned, today we are at gate 106 of 108. Horses are headed for the barn. All right. So our gate statement for today. Attainment of realization of the Dharma of non-appearance is a gate of Dharma-illumination, for with it we attain affirmation. So this gate statement is pointing to the last item in a list of 4 things. You know how we love lists. And one of the things this set of 108 gates is doing sometimes is pointing us to lists we didn't know existed. Lots of obscure lists. So this is pointing to the last item in a list of 4 things called the 4 assurances of Buddhahood. These come from the Surangama Samadhi Sutra, right? Not to be confused with the Surangama Sutra. So in this sutra, Buddha is describing fantastic powers and transformational abilities of practitioners who attain a certain state of meditation called Surangama Samadhi. So this is also, sort of also called the Samadhi of heroic progression. Marching toward awakening. So Buddha is doing this in order to emphasize cause and effect, and we know that cause and effect is a really important sort of theme in our tradition. If you do good things, if you practice sincerely, you will receive a prediction or an assurance that you will also become a Buddha, right? So do the right stuff, Buddha says, you will also become a Buddha. So the prediction or the assurance of Buddhahood is a common theme in our tradition. And I think in the West, we don't talk about it so much. But if you look around in our tradition, it pops up throughout the Buddhist tradition. We see it in sutras. We also see it in the tale literature, the miracle tale literature, where it's one of the sort of basic elements of story structure, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So the context for these predictions or these assurances within the sutra is that Mara has shown up while Buddha is preaching this sutra. So we know there's something about these sutras which is often circular. During the course of preaching the sutra, something happens where you see that the sutra being preached is also what's going on, right? So these things tend to be circular. Mara shows up, and of course his objective is to disrupt the Buddha doing his teaching. This is what Mara does. So as soon as Buddha starts preaching, Mara can hear this sutra, but right from the beginning he finds himself bound, sort of bound hand and foot. He's unable to come and make trouble because the Buddha is preaching this particular sutra. So one of the bodhisattvas asks why Buddha doesn't just keep Mara from hearing this thing in the first place and prevent trouble that way, because of course Buddha can do that, right? He says, you're preaching this wonderful sutra, rather than, he hears it, but he can't do anything. Why don't you just prevent him from hearing it altogether? And Buddha says, well, that's the wrong approach. Because even hearing the name of the sutra is a cause for future awakening. It's a cause for future Buddhahood. So that's even true for Mara. And if it's even true for Mara, then how much more should good people appreciate and practice what's being taught, right? So he's taking pity on Mara, right? He's having compassion for Mara. Even hearing this sutra, even hearing the title of it, is an assurance of future awakening. So one of the bodhisattvas asks whether he can go help Mara wake up. And Buddha says, well, okay, if you think so, if you think the time is right, if you think that's what you want to do, go ahead. So this bodhisattva goes to Mara and he says, okay, who bound you? He sees he's bound up. Who bound you? Mara says, well, as soon as he decided to go disrupt the Buddha, he was bound and he couldn't move. So this bodhisattva says, well, all beings are bound as soon as they're caught up in their own ideas, right? Delusions, false views. And we know that feeling, right? We're immediately stuck. So at the same time that we know that we're bound by all of these things, this bodhisattva says, at the same time, there's really nothing that's bound. There's nothing that's bound and there's nothing that's liberated because, A, you've done this to yourself. B, there's no difference between binding and liberation, right? Samsara and nirvana, there's no difference. So on the one hand, we're doing things which bind us, and on the other hand, there's no binding and there's nothing being bound because there's no difference between binding and liberation. So he says, you won't get free by destroying your false views because true and false are your own idea. True and false are your own sort of dichotomy. So destroying those views, there's nothing actually there to destroy. So Mara hatches a plan. And Mara says, okay, I arouse bodhicitta and I want to plant good roots, right? I'm going to say all the right things. And immediately he's freed from his bonds. And of course, he doesn't mean any of this, right? This is his cunning plan, right? So he just wants to get to Buddha. He just wants to make trouble. He just wants to, get free so he can go do the things that he does. So he takes all of his retinue and he goes to the Buddha and he says to the Buddha, I demand you teach something else. Don't talk about this sutra. Don't teach this thing. I really want you to talk about something else because this sutra binds me up. So, stop. Buddha says, well, who untied your bonds? And, Mara says, well, this guy, this bodhisattva over here came and, set me free. And the Buddha says, well, what did you promise in return for that? And Mara says, well, I promised to arouse bodhicitta. Okay, Buddha says, well, he's done this with an ulterior motive. Of course, Buddha knows this, right? Buddha knows everything. And the same thing is going to happen after I die. So after I die, a lot of practitioners are going to try to arouse bodhicitta in order to get something, right? In order to imitate others. So, this is a reflection of this set of the ages of the Dharma, right? There's an age where the Dharma flourishes, and there's an age where the Dharma sort of starts to decline, and then there's an age where, Dharma kind of isn't available to people. So he's saying this is the start of this thing. When I die, people are going to arouse bodhicitta, and they're going to come to practice, but they're going to come for their own kind of purposes. And that's the slide. That's the beginning of the slide. However, Buddha says, I know that this will still be the cause and condition of their awakening. So hearing this, arousing bodhicitta, no matter what's kind of causing you to arouse bodhicitta, is still a cause for awakening, just like Mara. And people are going, what the heck? Because Mara is, a deeply evil person, supposedly. So Mara says, wait a minute, I came here with this bad intention. I aroused this bodhicitta and said all the right things and came here with this bad intention of disrupting your teaching, and you're saying I'm still going to be a Buddha at some point? And, Buddha says, yep, haha, joke's on you, right? So Mara and his assembly are like puzzled by this. They're dismayed by this because they didn't come with a good intention, and yet somehow they're getting a good result, says the Buddha. So Buddha talks some more about predictions, because now he has to clear this up for everybody. Because you remember, whenever Buddha's preaching, he's got 40 billion beings listening, right? So he's got to clear this up for everybody because people are dismayed by this. How come Mara, with all of his evil intent, is still getting a prediction of Buddhahood? So Buddha says there are 4 sort of assurances of Buddhahood. This is the list of 4 that I mentioned a minute ago. So they are prediction or assurance for somebody who has not yet aroused bodhicitta. Prediction made for someone who has just aroused bodhicitta. Prediction made unbeknownst to the practitioner, him or herself. And a prediction made in the presence of one who has attained realization of the Dharma of non-appearance. Now we're back to our Gates statement, right? So this is the 4th. Gates statement is pointing to the 4th one of these. So let's take a brief look at each one of these, and then we'll focus on that 4th one in our Gates statement. So the first one, prediction for someone who has not yet aroused bodhicitta. So this is for the person who's sort of living every day, transmigrating through the 6 realms of samsara, but he's got his wits about him, right? He wants to do the right thing. Somewhere in here, wants to live in a wholesome way. After many, many, many lifetimes, finally he's going to become a bodhisattva. He's going to vow to save all beings, and he's going to work to implement that vow. Buddha already knows what his name will be, what his Buddha fields are like, what his lifespan is, what kind of a legacy he's going to leave. Buddha already knows this, right? So Shariputra points out that, well, if that's the case, then it doesn't really do for us to disparage anybody, because we have no idea where somebody may be on the path, even if the appearance is this person is not aroused bodhicitta and may in fact be doing unwholesome things. We don't know where that person is on this path. So, we don't know how close to Buddhahood somebody might actually be. So who are we to disparage people? Only Buddha can really see where somebody is on the path, and if we kind of get judgy about that, we only hurt ourselves. We're not doing something wholesome. Buddha says, yep, absolutely right. You don't know who's in front of you. It might be a Buddha in front of you. You can't recognize that. Only a Buddha knows a Buddha. So, second thing on the list, prediction for someone who has just aroused bodhicitta. So the Buddha says there are people who have established good roots. They're practicing the paramitas. They're living a wholesome life. At this point, their progress is irreversible. Dharma's got them. Going to reel them in. There's no getting away. So it's an absolute certainty that at some point they're going to leap off the wheel of transmigration. they're going to manifest Buddhahood. And again, only the Buddha knows their names and their Buddha fields and their lifespan and their legacy. Third on the list, prediction made unbeknownst to the practitioner, him or herself. So this is what happens when other people wonder, what's going on with so-and-so? Where is so-and-so on the list, on the path? So there's a practitioner sort of practicing the paramitas, steadily growing, steadily moving along the path, moving toward Buddhahood. This person has no doubts. This person has no reservations. But, other people want to know, well, how long is it going to take this person, and what's his name going to be, and, how many fields will he have, and all that stuff, right? You're curious about other people. So in order to put those doubts to rest, then Buddha makes a prediction, but he doesn't do it in front of the practitioner. He does it to calm the doubts of other people, right? Because this practitioner has no doubts, but others might. So this is not something which is done in order to sort of move that practitioner along the path. This is done for the benefit of the Sangha, the benefit of others. So finally, the fourth one, prediction made in the presence of one who has attained the realization of the Dharma of non-appearance. What a mouthful. So in this case, practitioner has been practicing for a very long time, has established good roots, lots of good karma, sees everything clearly, sees everything deeply, knows all about no self and emptiness, and knows very well that ultimately dharmas do not arise and perish, right? With this view of emptiness and with wisdom, this person very clearly sees dharmas do not arise and perish. Now we have the dharma of non-appearance, right? So Buddha knows that this person has perfected wisdom, has gained all the possible merit that there is to gain. So in front of everybody, all the bodhisattvas and devas and brahmas and beings, he makes a public prediction, so-and-so will have such-and-so name and Buddha fields and time frame and legacy, right? So now, even though this practitioner is overjoyed to get this prediction, directly from Buddha, again, it seems this is not actually just for his or her own benefit. There's, when everyone else hears this prediction, then they themselves wake up in imitation of this wonderful practitioner. So again, there's more than just the person on the path, right? There's the whole community, and there's all beings and what these predictions are doing for them. So as we get close to the end of this list of 108 gate statements, we start to see some threads, or at least I do, starting to sort of come together, right? In this number 106, some things are starting to come together. So all the elements and all the practices that this sutra describes as being part of this path to awakening have already been covered in other places in this 108. So in just this summary that I've been talking about this morning, I'm mentioning, not being selfish, not having gaining ideas in undertaking our practice, understanding that there's no difference between samsara and nirvana, believing in cause and effect, right? That good roots lead to good outcomes. Good things happen if we plant good roots and practice sincerely. Practicing paramitas, like giving and making effort and cultivating wisdom. This is all familiar territory for us, right? We've all heard about this before. So, attainment of realization of the Dharma of non-appearance is a gate of Dharma-illumination, for with it we attain affirmation. Affirmation. So back at gate 51, we also talked, you may or may not remember, we also talked about the realization of non-appearance. This is not actually the first time we've come across this. So 51 was realization of non-appearance as a gate of Dharma-illumination, for with it we experience the truth of cessation. So quick review, what we said back there. Realization of non-appearance is to recognize and to accept that nothing really arises or perishes, right? Here we are again. So, which is another way to say all conditioned phenomena are empty. So the truth of cessation is just another way to say nirvana. So realization of the Dharma of non-appearance in gate 51, it leads to nirvana. In gate 106, it leads to assurance or prediction of Buddhahood. Right? So we see some connections here. So the first, although this gate is really referring only to the fourth of these four assurances, I'm taking that to mean it's actually pointing to the whole list. Right? So I think we can read into this gate all of these four and how they work together as a system, the whole set. So the first time I encountered prediction of Buddhahood as a sort of element in this tradition was one of my earliest trips to Japan. So I was with a group visiting Hokyoji, in Fukui, not Hokyoji in Minnesota, Hokyoji in Japan. So as an aside, Hokyoji is an important temple for us because it was founded by Jakuen, who was a Chinese monk who came to practice with Dogen at Eiheiji. He left there after Dogen died, so went on to create this historically very important temple. So when we arrived at Hokyoji, the head of this temple, who's also very well known in his universe, came to have tea with us and make a few remarks. And I remember being sort of awed and intimidated by this guy because I knew who he was. And he was quite formal in what he was doing. So here's this group of scraggly-looking Westerners, and he immediately predicted we were all going to be Buddhas. And that was the first time I'd really encountered that. I went, whoa, right? Because, to look at any of us, we were fairly inexperienced Westerners. And yet as part of, his relatively brief remarks, he predicts we're all going to be Buddhas. I was kind of struck by that. Partly I think it was just the temple that I was in and where I was, and I was kind of overawed anyway, kind of had the starry-eye thing going on. But then you have this teacher in front of you saying, all of you are going to be Buddhas, and you just go, I don't know what to do with that, right? Part of you goes, yeah, that's the thing that gets said. But part of you thinks, okay, I'm sitting in a place where, like, this is a really historically important temple, and in the middle of this, someone's telling me I'm going to be a Buddha. So, he seemed pretty confident. He looked at all of us scraggly, exhausted Westerners, and I thought, how can he be so confident that people like us are all going to be Buddhas? So it's important to know, I think, when we hear this kind of prediction, or we read this in the sutras, that we will be Buddhas or others will be Buddhas. This is not it's not a comment on our own virtue. It's not a comment on our own kind of worthiness, right? We're not better than anybody else, or we haven't done anything at that point really to earn that prediction. It really has more to do with the efficiency of Buddha's wisdom and the efficacy of Buddha's teaching in moving us toward Buddhahood. So according to the Lotus Sutra, someone who hears one phrase of Dharma, someone who arouses even one moment of aspiration will become a Buddha. So that's not about I'm particularly worthy, right? So even Devadatta, who is again a pretty evil character in our Buddhist tradition, receives this prediction. So Devadatta, of course, was Shakyamuni's cousin. These two had some karmic affinity. Lifetime after lifetime, they kept showing up in each other's orbit. So Devadatta specialized in opposing everything Buddha did. He was the obstacle to everything Buddha did. He tries to split the Sangha and take it over. He even tries to murder the Buddha at more than one point, right? Comes at him with poison thorns and all kinds of things, right? So yet somehow in this sutra, Devadatta is a bodhisattva who helps Shakyamuni to realize awakening. And the Buddha says, well, in a past life, Devadatta was my teacher. So isn't this interesting? On the one hand, we have a whole, sort of karmic stream that says this guy's coming after me to murder me. And we have another whole karmic stream that says this guy was my teacher and he moved me toward awakening. So that story gets interpreted in various kinds of ways. One is as an illustration of the non-separation of good and evil. So here we are again, samsara nirvana, good and evil, right? Not separate. So Shakyamuni and Devadatta are interconnected in some way, life after life. Each of them does wholesome things. Each of them also does unwholesome things. So nobody's living a completely pure life or a completely evil life over the course of time. These things are interconnected. So another interpretation is that Devadatta was really a great bodhisattva, a very great selfless bodhisattva, because he was intentionally racking up all of this bad karma in order to push Shakyamuni and others toward awakening. So one interpretation is he's going to take all this on himself as a great bodhisattva because he wants to push Shakyamuni toward awakening. So if that's the case, then we can see how Buddha can predict that Devadatta will also become a Buddha in a future life, because apparently he's done all these apparently evil things with a different kind of motivation. So Devadatta is just one example of the myriad kind of predictions of Buddhahood in the Lotus Sutra. There are lots of them. There are pages of them. Buddha starts with Mahakashyapa, his most accomplished disciple, gives him a very specific prediction. So he says, in a future life, this disciple of mine, Mahakashyapa, will go before 3 million billion world-honored Buddhas, making offerings to them, revering, honoring, and praising them, and proclaiming the innumerable great teachings of the Buddhas everywhere. In his final incarnation, he will be able to become a Buddha whose name will be Radiance Tathagata, one worthy of offerings, truly awakened, fully clear in conduct, well gone, understanding the world, unexcelled leader, trainer of men, teacher of heavenly beings and people, Buddha, world-honored one. His land will be called Radiant Virtue, and his eon will be named Magnificently Adorned. The lifetime of this Buddha will be 12 small eons. His land will be magnificently adorned, free of all evil pollution, rubble, thorns or thistles, and filthy toilet waste. The land will be level and smooth, with no high or low places, hills or valleys. The ground will be lapis lazuli, lines of jeweled trees, and golden cords will mark off its roads. It will have precious flowers scattered over it, and the whole place will be pure and clean. The bodhisattvas of that land will be innumerable hundreds of billions, and there will be innumerable shravakas. There will be no deeds of the devil there, and though the devil and the devil's people will be there, they will all defend the Buddha Dharma. Isn't that interesting? So this is sort of the boilerplate-like description of predictions. So we get a name, we get, kind of what he's going to be doing. His name will be Radiance Tathagata. His land will be Radiant Virtue. Here's what the land looks like. His lifetime will be 12 small eons. So we get all of these kind of elements in a prediction from the Buddha about Buddhahood. So all of this is pretty encouraging, right? I mean, if you heard a prediction like this, you kind of wouldn't get off the path, right? Not only for Mahakashyapa, but for all these other myriad, million, billion beings that are listening to this, right? Like this could be you. So on hearing this, each layer, each level of all these beings all want their own prediction of Buddhahood. Well, if he's getting one, what about this one? So now the point of all this becomes Buddha dispelling all the doubts of all of the other people. Well, if he's got a prediction, do I get one too? So now this becomes an exercise in sort of dispelling everybody's doubts. So then another group of high-level disciples all plead sincerely for a prediction. If he gets one, what about us? Interesting, these, excuse me, these aren't beginners. These are really experienced practitioners, right? So Buddha makes another set of very specific predictions for each of them. Good, that's fine, they're happy. Next, there's a group of 500 arhats. They all want their own predictions. He makes predictions for the 500 arhats. Next comes a group of 1,200 arhats. They all want their own predictions. So the way this is described is every time this happens, all of these people come to Buddha with their hands in gusho, gazing up pleadingly, saying, please, please give me a prediction of Buddha. So 1,200 more arhats all get predictions. Then come along the 2,000 lesser disciples, and he makes another 2,000 predictions, including Ananda, by the way, right? He's in that group. Then we get finally to Shakyamuni's mother and 6,000 nuns, because they're all going, well, all these guys are getting predictions. What about the nuns? He makes predictions for his mother and all the 6,000 nuns. Last but not least, he finally gets to his wife, and he makes a prediction for her. So it's interesting. All the women come at the end, but be that as it may. So now, at last, everybody is reassured. Everybody's had a prediction. Everybody's at peace about the practice. Yes, this is worth doing. If I sincerely practice, at some point, lifetime after lifetime, I too will achieve Buddhahood. Everybody knows that, even though it's going to take a long, long time, it's going to take some stick-to-itiveness, right? Lifetime after lifetime. Eventually, they will all have lovely Buddha lands, and they will all have names like seen with joy by all the living Tathagatas, or, having 10 million shining characteristics. These are some of the names that go out to people. If that was your name, wouldn't you want to practice? Seen with joy by all the living Tathagatas? I mean, my goodness. Kind of puts Hoko to shame. So as I mentioned, predictions of Buddhahood. Also an important element in the tale literature. So you may or may not know, there's a very large, within the Buddhist tradition, genre of tale literature. Moving, starting in India, moving through China and to Japan. So the Avadanas in India, these are sometimes derived from the Vinaya, but sometimes they're not canonical. They're actually created in order to sort of make a point. So that's in India, carries all the way through to the Bukkyo Setsuwa genre in Japan. So sometimes these come from, as I say, teachings in sutras, teachings in the Vinaya, but they're not high-class literature aimed at scholars, aimed at important clergy, right? The point of these things was that they were designed to be accessible. They were designed to popularize the Dharma. And again, we could investigate deeply how these get used to popularize certain sects, certain teachers, certain temples, right? There's a whole... So some of these stories are written as stories outside of the canon, right? They were actually written to be tales, to be entertaining tales. So Buddhist miracle tales were a particular interest of mine when I was in grad school, because this to me was a sort of undiscovered territory. This was a whole kind of medieval Asian Buddhist vernacular literature that I didn't know anything about, but the connections with practice were really interesting to me. So in my experience, again, these are not something we talk about a lot in North America. I get why, because mostly they're tales of the fantastic. And as Doju pointed out last time, we modern Westerners pride ourselves on being scientific and not superstitious and not caught up in sort of tales of the fantastic. So in a broad sense, the Avadanas fall into sort of the ethics or morality or Shila section of the Eightfold Path. They outline a sort of a moral code. So they're about good and bad deeds really and the results of those actions. So again, we're back to cause and effect, right? Deep faith in cause and effect. So there's also this strong underlying, so there's this thread we can see that sort of is pulling through these stories. It's talking about cause and effect, but it's almost always very specifically talking about practice, like you do some kind of practice or you live in an ethical way and some good result happens. So that's also a foundational element for us in general, right? And it's one of Dogen's major themes. So we see this sort of thread moving all the way through, all the way down to us today. So many Avadanas have a three-part structure, right? There's a story in the present tense where the main characters meet the Buddha. They experience some kind of practice benefit. He teaches them to do something, or they learn something, and they see some immediate benefit of that. There's a story of the past in which Buddha sort of tells about actions and how those actions played out and came to fruition and some karma unfolded. And then there's an intersection where the Buddha identifies the people that are in front of him right now as the people in the story. So he says, I'm meeting you today, I'm going to practice with you today, we have an experience today, but now I'm going to tell you the story of something that happened in the past. People did something and something happened, and oh, by the way, that was you, right? That was you in a past life. So the stories were designed to teach the Dharma, spread the Dharma, in a time and a place where people really didn't read or study or do that sort of thing. Really, folks had all they could do to raise their families, run their businesses, right? Farm their fields. Like all humans, however, they were suffering. They wanted the suffering to stop. So this was a way to share the Dharma, teach the Dharma, in a way that was not about having to do sort of deep academic study. So there were any number of spiritual teachers around, spiritual practices around. We know from last week, Doju was telling the story about the Kalamas, that all these teachers had come through and they're going, what do we believe? So we know there's lots of options around. I'm sure one of the purposes of the stories was to show how wonderful Buddhism was, right? How effective practice was in this marketplace of spiritual stuff. So, do good, follow the teachings, you too will become a Buddha. I mean, that's a pretty engaging and encouraging and interesting premise. Because, the people in the stories were not all rich and powerful people. They were poor people, there were lepers, there were folks who were deeply deluded. These are the people who are engaging in practice or being in these stories, right? So it's not all stories about kings and princes and rich people. So some were animals, particularly the food animals, if you will, that go to Buddha for refuge. Pigs and cows go to Buddha for refuge and don't get killed and eaten, and get reborn sometime later as Buddhas, which is kind of interesting. So, somehow even a moment of good intention leads to a good outcome in all of these stories, even if it's the tiniest moment of bodhicitta, of good intention, of hearing a sutra, hearing a teaching. Somehow, after many, many lifetimes, there's always a good outcome. So here's an example of a story one of the Abhidanas, this does not exactly follow the three-part structure, and we see that there's some variety. So Buddha's going on his alms round. A Brahmin's daughter sees him. She realizes who he is. There's something about him, which clearly, he's carrying something. She realizes who he is. She offers some barley meal for his alms round. Buddha smiles. Buddha emits various rays of light from his being, because this is what Buddha does. What these look like indicate what kind of a prediction he's about to make. So it's like having, a neon sign. What color neon is it today? This is what kind of prediction, Buddha's going to make. So Buddha asks Ananda, did you see that girl that, came up and offered me this Buddha meal, had this moment of faith and came up and offered me this thing? Ananda says, well, yes, I saw her. So Buddha says, because of this virtue of seeing who I was and arousing a bit of bodhicitta and giving me this offering, she will not suffer karmic downfall for 13 eons. And after transmigrating around and around, but in the highest three realms of samsara, not all of them, not the lowest ones, but the highest ones, in her last life, she's going to become a Buddha, and her name is going to be Supranihita. So he's making a prediction for her. We see the pattern again, right? So meanwhile, her husband comes back from the forest. He's been gathering flowers and firewood and trying to make a living. He comes back from the forest. He hears that she's made this offering and that she's received this prediction of Buddhahood, and he's infuriated. He's beside himself. He goes to the Buddha, waving his arms and accusing the Buddha of lying in order to get offerings, right? So you made up this story so that you could weasel some food out of my wife. Who's going to believe that just her giving you this little bit of meal is going to make you, make somebody a Buddha? So it's got to be a lie. Buddha says, well, so how big is a seed? Is a seed as big as a tree? The guy says, well, no, a seed's not as big as a tree. So isn't it pretty amazing that a tiny seed can turn into a big tree? Well, okay, yeah. Well, so you see that I have the marks of Buddha, because I'm sure he's displaying all of his 32 marks of Buddha, right? So would a Buddha tell lies even for the sake of hundreds of thousands of kingdoms? Well, no, I guess not. Because, here's the Buddha. What does he need to be lying to somebody for to get a bit of barley meal? He's got 1 billion Buddha fields. Well, I guess not. So by the end of the conversation, of course, the husband has heard some kind of a Dharma discourse on the Four Noble Truths. He's aroused bodhicitta, and he himself becomes Buddha's disciple. So we always know at the end, everybody becomes Buddha's disciple. So in the Japanese Buddhist tale literature, prediction usually takes the form of a revelation. So the Buddha is no longer on earth at this point, right, to give these predictions personally, because this is Japan, right? It takes a while for the practice to get to Japan. So the main character of these stories is often somebody who's engaged in some kind of regular devout practice. Sometimes, on the one hand, engaging in whatever this wholesome practice is, and on the other hand, at the same time, doing some really unwholesome stuff. So these characters are usually really kind of conflicted. It's really interesting. I'm chanting some wonderful thing at the same time that I'm doing some unwholesome thing, right? So usually, the arc of the story is that this person has a strange dream or meets with an unusual being. Out of the fog comes some unusual being who somehow this person receives some instruction. So they receive it in a dream, in a vision, they meet some unusual being. When those instructions are followed, or when the events of this dream finally come to pass, it becomes clear that this being, whoever has appeared, is a bodhisattva, typically Jizo or Kannon, appearing in some other form. Sometimes it's a child, sometimes it's an old person, whatever. So this person receiving this revelation has an epiphany, ordains, becomes part of the Buddhist Sangha. When this person dies, there are mysterious clouds and lovely fragrances and rays of light and all kinds of things, and he's reborn in the Pure Land and greeted by Amida. So again, we don't have a sort of prediction. We have something that's like a revelation. A bodhisattva comes and says, do these things. He does them. The dream comes to pass. He's reborn in the Pure Land. So, okay, why do we care about these predictions or assurances of Buddhahood? Like, how do we practice with that? Because I'm pretty sure none of us thinks we're going to leave the zendo, meet a being in the street, get a prediction of Buddhahood. So one way this comes down to us is through Dogen Zenji's emphasis on practice and awakening or not too. So as soon as we sit down in zazen, Buddha is there. So this morning we all sat down in zazen, and this many Buddhas were there. So, this is not Buddha's next to me, Buddha's floating around me. Buddha's right here in this body and mind as soon as we sit down and do the 4 things we do and open the hand of thought. So there's a saying that zazen is not a practice of human beings. Zazen is a practice of Buddhas. So if someone even does 1 minute of zazen, Buddha shows up. So we can see this as a prediction and as a sort of a support to our faith in the 3 treasures and our faith in the practice. From that perspective, we don't need to wait myriad lifetimes for this prediction to come true. We don't need to wait, eons and eons for Buddha to appear or for us to manifest Buddhahood. We don't have to be reborn in a special place. We don't have to escape our current circumstances. We sit down, Buddha's there. So there's a place in the ceremony of receiving lay precepts, and some folks are wearing rakusus and have received lay precepts. After the 16 precepts have been received, and we've bestowed lineage papers, toward the end of the ceremony, the preceptor says, when living beings receive the Buddha's precepts, they immediately join the Buddhas. When their state is identical to great enlightenment, they are truly the children of the Buddhas. So in its way, that's a bit of a prediction, right? Simply wholeheartedly vowing to keep precepts, even though we know we're going to break them, is enough to let us join the Buddhas. Interesting. So Mara aroused bodhicitta with an ulterior motive, no intention of following through, still got this prediction of Buddhahood. Devadatta tries to murder the Buddha, tries to split the Sangha. Talk about not honoring the 3 treasures, right? I mean, like in the biggest possible way. Devadatta still gets a prediction. So, when we realize the Dharma of non-appearance, when we understand emptiness, and we sort of let go of the clinging to things, we go straight to nirvana as Buddhas, because nirvana is already here, right? Buddhas are already here. We go straight to our own Buddha fields, I hope, of peace and contentment. And, the important thing, of course, to know is that field is not somewhere else. That field is right here. So nirvana is right here. The field is right here. The practice is right here. If we can see with the eyes of Buddha, we can see all the jewel trees and all the golden cords and all the things that are described in these Buddha fields. But interestingly, also the unpleasant, undesirable things disappear from the Buddha field. So you remember this description of the Buddha field said there was no unwholesome stuff, there was no filthy, toilet mess, there was nothing like that, right? So how can that happen? Well, we're not labeling, we're not judging, we're not chasing and running away, right? We're not saying this thing is unclean, this thing is clean, this thing is desirable, this thing is not desirable. As soon as we see in a way that allows us to let go of the judging and the clinging and the chasing and the running away, somehow right there, right? There's the Buddha field, there's nirvana. So I think the message of this gate is pretty simple. If we live wholesome lives, if we practice sincerely, if we try to do the right thing, all of us are going to become Buddhas, right? So what would you like to say about predictions of Buddhahood, assurances of Buddhahood, getting your own Buddha field?
You just give us a prediction.
Can I give you a prediction?
You just did.
That all of us here would be Buddhas?
Yeah. So can we each get a name now?
I suspect we all know what our names are, that you don't need to hear it from me. What would folks like to say about any of that? Let's start with folks at home just because I can see you first. Anything in the room here? Oh, and please.
It struck me as very compassionate in the sutra where he says Devadatta was like a teacher in a past life, right? And I'm thinking of what you said about kind of in the West nowadays, scientific mindset, like that type of thing is kind of untenable, right? You can't just say that to someone and they're gonna be like, oh no, I feel understood, right? But I'm very much struggling, I think, to come up with a skillful means alternative to communicate the same type of idea, right? Not anything that necessarily refers to reincarnation, but I think the intent there is I see what merit, what value, what you're contributing, even if it's not clear, right?
Yeah.
I think I might want to put you on the spot and see if you have anything inspired.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, I used to get the biggest kick when I was working for the government. I used to get the biggest kick out of taking my practice to work, and it wasn't that I was showing up like this. You know, I mean, you work for the government, nobody's separation of church and state, you have to be careful. But, you know, I really got a big kick out of startling people by complimenting them or noticing something that they were really good at doing that was not something that was generally thought of as a, what do I want to say? It's not something you put on a resume. Every once in a while, somebody would decide to engage in a 360 review. I don't know if anyone knows what a 360 review is. So you get input, and it's all done anonymously, from the people you supervise, and from your peers, and from your boss. So it's 360, right? And there's a form for it, and there's a way that you do it. So every once in a while, some of my peers would say, I'm doing this 360 review. You know, would you fill this out? Sure. And I tried to look really carefully at what the person was doing that typically didn't get understood as adding value. And it had a lot to do with like how they saw the world, right? I used to work in communications, right? So I did this once for one of our people who was primarily a photographer. He did a lot of other things, but primarily a photographer. And so I remember writing something that said, you know, you're really good at sort of like capturing, this is going to sound really Buddhist, the essence of this moment in one image. Now I had to be careful how I said that, right, so it wouldn't make sense. But it's like, you're really good at distilling down, like, what's the feeling of this thing? Because like he would go to like a wastewater plant, but he would go like at dawn. So all the steam is rising, and all the architectural stuff was really cool. And he would shoot like pictures of the wastewater plant that were like beautiful. Well, it's a wastewater plant. I mean, if you've been in a wastewater plant on Monday morning, the smell is not great. But you know, he would like distill this impression. Really interesting. So I said, you know, you have an ability to see that, and not only to sort of see that, but to like portray that to somebody, to share that with somebody in an image. And he was like shocked. And you would think, well, the guy's a photographer, okay. But you know, I tried to get underneath it and say there's something about the way you see the world which is important. You see what others don't see, and you're able to share that with us, right? So it's like, can we point out the thing that most people would go, yeah, yeah. So like, I know a few people who are detail people. I am clearly not, right? I live way up here. I know a few people who are detail people. They are exceptionally good at managing sort of the logistical stuff around people's comfort. So they're the ones, if you go to their temple, they're going to make sure everyone's got a chair, everyone's got a meal, everyone feels welcome, right? It's going to be very much about, is the room warm enough? Do you have everything you need? And they do that like instinctively. And that's not something that would typically get recognized as a skill, but it really is, because like that's not my forte. I mean, I'm happy to see everybody, but I'm not necessarily going to manage the detail that way. They're going to go, there aren't enough chairs, you know? It's like, those are such small, simple, everyday things, but we don't all do them, and we don't all see the world that way. I think it's just really important to recognize we've all got something we see and something we offer which is not like everybody else. So any skill can be useful or not useful. So if somebody is so caught up with how many chairs we need in the room that they're not doing the larger stuff, that can be a problem. But if we're only doing the larger stuff and we're not like taking care of the building, that's a problem too, right? So it's like we need both of these things. Anything carried to an extreme is a problem. So, you know, in a government agency where that was not the norm, I mean, I liked my coworkers, everyone was very nice, but I mean, like, that's not what the government encourages you to do, right? So in a place where that was not the norm, I used to love going around and just finding that little thing, go, you know, you're really good at this thing. And they're like, nobody ever noticed that. Like, why is that even valuable when you think about it? I mean, all that stuff is valuable. Right? So, you know, we can't go around saying, hello, my name is Owen, I predict you're going to be a Buddha, right? I mean, you wouldn't do that. But how can we encourage, support, recognize, validate wholesome behavior? There's tons of ways we can do that. We can do it in really simple, very subtle ways. But first we have to see it, right? First we have to notice, there's something going on here that person didn't do that thing, this would all fall to pieces. Or if somebody wasn't doing this or that, you know, suffering would happen. Something would not be as good if that person wasn't doing that thing. So you don't want to get patronizing about it, you don't want to get cute about it, and you don't want to be kind of sticky. But if the things you recognize are like really concrete, useful things, it's amazing. People sit up a little straight, they go, oh, right? Because sometimes, I think especially in a circumstance where what gets valued is visionary leadership and big thinking and all of that, the little stuff gets forgotten. Or the people who do the little stuff are somehow less than, right? And yet, if we didn't have people doing both things, no matter what your organization is, if it's your family, your business, your sangha, whatever, it's like we didn't have people seeing things differently, seeing differently with the eyes of Buddha, things won't work, right? So I just think there's ways we can be present for each other that kind of move us in the direction that you're talking about, right? You can't go up and make a prediction of Buddhahood to most people, but can you encourage them? That I think you can, and I think you can do it in ways that, because of our practice, maybe we see something that others don't see. That in itself is a really interesting practice, right? Like, what do I see in somebody that maybe they don't typically get recognized for? That's one idea. Any follow-up to that?
Well, you were very astute in extracting what I was trying to ask. Right? Mm-hmm.
You just did it for her.
That's why it's fun.
See? It works. It works. What would others like to say? Predictions of Buddhahood. Jeff,
I was
please.
gonna say what I got from what you just said was I thought what you were actually doing is giving a lesson in community, not so much in dealing with people,
So I think if we're not dealing skillfully with people, we're not dealing skillfully with community, are we? Yeah. So I think, what that points me to is if I'm trying to encourage somebody toward Buddhahood, again, these predictions of Buddhahood are not about our own personal, not entirely about our own personal merit. Why am I encouraging somebody? Well, certainly I want somebody to be liberated from suffering. But ultimately, if we were all living wholesome lives, would our communities not be more wholesome? Would this world not be more wholesome? Where does it start? I can't fix a world system by myself. I can encourage somebody, though, to do something wholesome. And if we're all encouraging and supporting each other to do something wholesome and pointing out, if you pay any attention to sort of management trends, there's always the flavor of the month. And for a while it was catching people doing something right. Anyone remember that whole phase? There was a whole phase about you want to catch people doing something right because then you want to say, look, you did this right, good for you. Where so often all people hear is you did that wrong, you made that mistake, you didn't do this well enough, right? Catch somebody doing something right. So it's kind of like that, right? And I think so often we may even notice somebody doing something positive and we go, oh, isn't that nice? But we don't tell them. So I kind of made a practice of if I'm like, one time I was in a Taco Bell or someplace, and the chicken salad was particularly well made that day. And I went up to the counter, and the poor lady behind the counter thought I was coming to complain. And I said, actually, I'm here to say that was one of the better chicken salads I've ever had here. Please tell whoever made that they did a good job. Because like how often do you hear that? Especially in a retail environment, all you hear is grief, right? So I mean, if we can catch people doing those things and encourage that, it's like, why wouldn't we do that? And overall then, don't we build better communities? And don't we build, a healthier sort of structure for ourselves where, I'm not saying be a Pollyanna, yeah, there's problems. We need to fix the problems. There's no question. There's negative out there too. But we kind of don't focus on the positive. We kind of focus on the negative. So if I see somebody, somebody's helping me, or I'm in a store or a retail environment or the doctor's office or something, and I notice something is going particularly well, why not just take the 30 seconds to say, hey, I appreciate that you did that. Amen. That probably made that person's day. It would have for me when I was in retail. I spent a lot of years in retail. What you get is not always positive. So, okay? So you're right, there's a larger ramification. If we're all going to become Buddhas, I mean, what a community that will be. And here it is.
I used to tell my students that in the world of Buddhism, mind you, this is an academic environment, in the world of Buddhism, you get an incomplete until you get an A.
Mm-hmm. And also, the minute you walk into the classroom, you have an A.
Well, I can't do that.
I know.
But this gave the motif of this gate reminds me of the story of the origins of Tibetan Buddhism, where Padmasambhava was a great tantric master. And the first monk they sent in, he came running back out of Tibet saying, I can't handle this, there's too many demons. But I know just the person, he's sort of like a tantric exorcist. He'll take care of your demons for you. So they sent in Padmasambhava. And so when he came in, he took the demons and used his Shakti, his powers, to pin them up against the mountains. And they started chanting mantras at them, sutras and so forth. All is impermanent, all is awakening. And at first they screamed, no, no, no. But eventually they start listening, and he converts the demons into bodhisattvas. So those demonic forms you see in the tapas, so those were used to be the demons that were converted into agents of the Dharma.
So not unlike this, excuse me, not unlike this description of Kashyap's prediction, where he said the devils will be there, but they will all be protecting and espousing Buddhism. So interesting. There's hope for us all. Anything else in this room? Excuse me. How about folks at home? Maybe Sawyer, you can facilitate for me. That would help. Oh, pardon me. We good?
Looks quiet at home.
Okay. All is quiet on the home front. I predict all of those at home.
They're already enlightened. So
They're already enlightened. They don't need anything more from me. They're already Buddhists. All right. Anything else this morning? Okay. Let's do our closing chant. Announcements and tea time. Thanks, everybody.